Yeah, sorry about that technology glitch. So I'm very pleased to be here. I would like to start acknowledging that I'm located on the unceded territory of the Khasi and Coquitlam First Nations. And what I would like to talk about is some of the innovations around urban areas that can start to work for both addressing climate change and the pandemic, or even future pandemics. And what I would like to do is, if you go to the next slide, please, to start talking about climate change in a broad context and talk about where the impacts are, and similarly look at the COVID-19 pandemic impact and talk about its broad impacts. And I've started to look at a side-by-side comparison of these two, and hopefully that would help us in understanding how some of the solutions can work to address both of these challenges. And as I go in describing those solutions, I would like to introduce two concepts which are based on the work that we are undertaking at the Pacific Water Research Center at Simon Fraser University. And these relate to low carbon resilience, where you address both climate change mitigation, reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and the adaptation to these changes. The second concept is the use of green infrastructure and nature-based solutions to address some of these problems. And I will then close off with some general examples of how these innovations are being used here in Metro Vancouver area and elsewhere. So next one, please. In terms of the impacts of climate change, I think many of you may already be quite familiar. Something that we say quite often is that if climate change is a shark, then water is its teeth. And a lot of the extremes that are related to climate change come through in terms of the frequency and strength of water-related impacts. These could be floods, these could be other weather systems, snowstorms, etc. So we know that these are increasing in frequency and strength, and they result in significant impacts, and those are also increasing over time. There are also some long-term impacts that relate to rise in sea level, and also in terms of redistribution of water resources, so that water becomes available in times when we are not used to it, so that results in either floods or droughts. And the impacts of these types of both short-term and long-term impacts are on a whole range of sectors, going all the way from agricultural, forestry to manufacturing and other commercial activity. And there are also impacts which are social and cultural in nature, and many of our customs are impacted. And similarly, we also have now recorded health impacts as a result of changing air quality, for example, or lack of access to food as a result of droughts. If you look at the COVID-19 pandemic, we see that there are now a nice documentation of impacts in terms of our well-being. Some of them are obviously direct impacts, as Taco was talking about. Others are indirect health impacts in terms of reduced access to health services while everything is on hold. There are learning impacts and impairments in children. There are psychological impacts in adults, and there are indeed similar type of social and cultural disruptions that, as we see with climate change. Once again, the economic impacts are quite widespread, and again, I think Taco gave us an overview of what those impacts are and what kind of job losses are there. In terms of the looking at the longer term prospects and the outcomes of this pandemic, we know that the business as usual would not continue anymore, and there would be major disruptions to many economic sectors, and in fact there would be emergence of new sectors. And I won't get into, it's a bit outside the scope of this conversation, but there are certainly geopolitical impacts and realities, new realities, which are going to impact on global trade patterns as well. Now, if you look at the two challenges side by side, you see some similarities. So if you can go to the next slide, please. The time scale is both are happening right as we speak. With climate change, I think the situation will gradually get worse, and we have good indications of how much worse things can get. Whereas for the pandemic, we're hoping that things start to improve. We also know that pandemics can be triggered by other biological agents, and in fact, experts are warning us about possible future pandemics as a result of bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics. In terms of disruptions to our lives, again, the health impacts are slightly different for climate change and the pandemic, but the consequences are similar in terms of our well-being. Similarly, there are impacts on food security. How we respond to those, how we adapt, I think is in many ways similar. So we can increase the resilience at the community level and see how we respond. And we also can rely on green economic solutions to address some of these challenges for climate change. And we can also build economic activities which are resistant to or which are resilient to these kind of solutions in future. So let me very quickly walk through those two concepts that I spoke about earlier. The first one is, thank you, the low carbon resilience concept, which is where you address both climate change mitigation and adaptation at the same time. And you can apply these concepts at various planning scales. SFU's adaptation to climate change team has been leading the design of these concepts, and you can actually achieve a lot of benefits by implementing and achieving both climate change mitigation and adaptation. You can increase the return on investments, and also you can save time and resources. There are a number of other co-benefits that accrue as well, and some of these are related to environmental protection, others are related to better preparedness against extreme events. Next one, please. And the concept is now fairly well defined. A number of cities and organizations and municipalities are adapting these type of approaches. And the idea is that you go away from a standard project design and you undertake a situation analysis where you address both adaptation and mitigation. You evaluate what the risks are, and then you start to merge your solutions together. And once you start taking action, you can actually start back the loop at the beginning. So I'm deliberately not going too much into detail here, but it's actually a very cool way of addressing two significant challenges at the same time. Next one, please. I think a significant way of addressing these low carbon resilience solutions is to look at green infrastructure. And this is by and large water management solutions which protect and restore or sometimes mimic natural processes. And you can use various types of plants, soils, and natural materials. I think many of you may be familiar with green roofs or rooftop gardens. Less common or less well-known are things like infiltration trenches or vegetated swales through which water can be incorporated, can be stored in the subsurface. Next one, please. And similarly, we have these rain gardens which can be implemented at either household level or at larger scale to address stormwater storage. Again, the benefits are quite a few by using these approaches. We can create a lot of green spaces, and in the current pandemic, we've discovered that having access to those type of green spaces is quite important in maintaining our health and well-being. These also provide opportunities for engaging citizens and making them more aware of the kind of solutions that they can implement in their own backyard sometimes to improve our responses to climate change. And it also allows us to look at better adaptability to future challenges. And particularly for coping with extreme high rate of flow rain events, floods, etc. There's also benefits in terms of lowering the maintenance costs and the removal of various pollutants that might otherwise go into our water bodies. There are obviously some challenges in implementing these type of solutions. I think primary amongst those are our level of knowledge and being able to convey these points to folks who are typically in engineering design programs in municipalities. And that results in less than sufficient allocation of resources of funds. So let me go to my concluding slide in terms of how these type of solutions can help reach both the objectives of addressing the climate change while addressing pandemic. And this can be done by engaging a whole range of stakeholders. And as I said earlier, low carbon resilience type approaches can be quite significant. So the first point is that in urban settings, we have to push through with a greater emphasis on walkable and walker-friendly spaces. And indeed, green infrastructure allows us to create those spaces, and you can serve multiple purposes. You can address extreme rain events and floods, while at the same time, you're also reducing costs and providing green space. You can also think about reducing water consumption, and these type of solutions allow us to raise consumer awareness. As we've found out in the current pandemic situation, that one important way of addressing it is by accessing safe water, practicing safe hygiene, and that is quite critical to protect whatever water resources we have. And we already are one of the highest water consumers in the world right here in Metro Vancouver area. And we need to somehow bring that down, and consumer awareness is an important part of that. Green infrastructure also allows us to produce vegetables, fruits locally, and that not only reduces the carbon footprint, but it increases the resilience to disruptions in flow of economic goods, particularly food. And it reduces our reliance on imported food products. And finally, we also have to improve our waste management practices, and particularly those in the food sector, where some of the waste management can be used for energy generation and resource recovery. So I'll stop here, and I look forward to interesting discussion and dialogue with the audience. So thank you very much for your attention.